Mr. President, I rise today deeply concerned that our Republican colleagues in their ideological haze have lost sight of the facts and the real people at home whose lives will be affected by the choices we make. They are lost in an ideological haze, a political dust storm that is distorting the facts and confusing process and policy with political propaganda. As the conservative columnist David Brooks has said, quote, a normal Republican Party would seize the opportunity to put the country on a sound fiscal footing. He calls it, quote, the mother of no-brainers. But it is true, as many have said, that this Republican Party is not your grandfather's Republican Party. It's not even Ronald Reagan's Republican Party. This Republican Party is so far to the right that it cannot even see the center where ideologies converge and good governance begins. This Republican Party sees the processes governing as one-sided, their side and no other. Today, those on the far right wave the Constitution that established a form of government to protect us from tyranny, yet see any form of compromise as defeat, and the only clear victory is total surrender to their position. And so here we are, working to try to ensure that reason prevails. We have offered the largest spending cuts in a generation, asking that those cuts be accompanied by closing tax loopholes and ending tax giveaways and unreasonable subsidies to those who need them the least. But because almost every Republican has signed Grover Norquist's Americans for Tax Reform pledge to never, ever raise any tax, and because they define closing tax loopholes as a tax increase, even when the recipients themselves have said they do not need those tax breaks, we are forced into this position, hoping that logical, moderate voices on the other side will rise up, demanding that what we do and is right for the American people take place. In my view, ending subsidies to big oil companies does not fall under that pledge. Only in Washington, would Republicans call ending $21 billion in tax breaks for big oil companies that will make $144 billion in profits a tax increase. It is not. It is not a tax increase. It is a measure of fairness. It is exactly what we need to do under the circumstances, and it is a reasonable offer by those of us on this side of the aisle. Now, our job in a representative democracy is to represent the values of those who sent us here, to do what's right for them, not wave a pledge and conveniently interpret the elimination of oil subsidies from multi-billion-dollar profitable corporations or ethanol subsidies to the tune of $2 billion as a tax increase. Mr. President, that's nonsense. We are offering a reasonable compromise, as that conservative columnist David Brooks says, the mother of no-brainers. Even USA Today said in their editorial, quote, compromise is an essential part of democracy, but negotiating with Republicans over taxes has become as futile as trying to bargain with the Taliban over whether girls should be allowed to attend school. Now, that's a pretty stark comparison, I admit, and I may not have gone that far, but frankly, our Republican brethren seem to hold to their ideology almost religiously. They see all things in black and white. They act as though they believe that those who disagree with that ideology are either unpatriotic or heretics, and that the only truth is their truth. What they have forgotten is that negotiating with those with whom we disagree and reaching a compromise is what good governance is all about. The other falsehood here is spending is not a democratic value, as our friends on the other side would have us believe. It is a Republican reality. It was the reckless spending of Republicans combined with a reckless tax policy and an ideology that let Wall Street run wild, turning a free market into a free-for-all market that brought us to where we are today. Let's remember, it wasn't long ago that the budget was, in fact, balanced during another Democratic administration, when we had budget surpluses as far as the eye could see. The day President Clinton left office, he handed the incoming president a $236 billion surplus, with a projected surplus of $5.6 trillion over the following 10 years. When President Bush left office, he had turned a $236 billion budget surplus into a $1.3 trillion budget deficit, with projected shortfalls of $8 trillion over the next decade. And he handed the new president an economy that was headed off the cliff into a near depression. We have spent $786 billion unpaid for on President Bush's ill-advised, wrong-headed war of choice in Iraq because of some false allegations of weapons of mass destruction, a political experiment that distracted us from a war of necessity in Afghanistan, keeping us there far longer than necessary, at an additional cost of $430 billion unpaid for, a total cost for both wars unpaid for of $1.2 trillion. The Republican Party that will not now agree to 1 penny in revenue and demands only more spending cuts has fought to make tax breaks for the wealthy permanent that would cost this nation another $5 trillion. They have favored big business and Wall Street and a tax code that has resulted in major multi-billion-dollar corporations paying no taxes, yes, no taxes at all. In fact, a detailed Government Accountability Office study of corporate income taxes from 1998 to 2005 showed that 55% of large U.S. corporations reported no tax liability for at least one of those 8 years. Yet those same Republicans will look us in the eye in defense of their defenseless position and tell us that most individuals do not pay taxes either. What they will not say is that those individuals who do not pay taxes for a reason. They do not earn enough to pay income tax, and many of them are among the poorest of the poor. Only in Washington could such an indefensible position be accepted as defensible and logical. Only in Washington could Republicans support policies that benefit the wealthiest at the expense of the middle class. Only in Washington could Republicans tell a construction worker in New Jersey who has cut his budget to the bone and needs to work another job to pay the bills that we don't need to end tax loopholes and tax breaks to help pay the nation's bills, that we only have to cut more spending and give more money to the top 1% of the wealthiest in the country, who control 45% of all of the wealth in America, and that they'll create more jobs. Notwithstanding the fact that 12 years of tax cuts for the wealthiest created virtually no jobs at all. When Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton increased the revenue side of the equation, it bought the last half century. But our Republican colleagues do not let the facts get in the way of their ideology. The fact is, if Joe, the construction worker in New Jersey, has cut his budget and his spending, has made the difficult choices about what he can afford and what he can't, and still can't meet bills that he has to pay with the money he earns, then he has to get a second job or work more hours or find a way to increase his income. And yet our Republican colleagues will look that construction worker in the eye and tell him he doesn't need to earn more. He needs to cut more, and then cut again. Cut to the bone if necessary, but never do what needs to be done to increase the revenue side. Mr. President, only in Washington does such an argument seem reasonable. Only does this Republican Party make an absurd argument try to make sense. Never before has America waged two wars at the same time struggled to invest in our infrastructure to create new jobs, and done so at a time of decreased revenue, and not seen the need at least to discuss the idea of closing tax loopholes and tax breaks for big oil and multi-billion-dollar corporations. Never before has any party claimed that we can do all of that and at the same time balance the budget on the back of seniors, students, middle-class families, and not even consider the shared sacrifice, a sacrifice that would end tax breaks for multi-billion-dollar corporations who in many cases don't even pay taxes. Never before has such illogic passed for logic. But our Republican colleagues will not take yes for an answer. We have said yes to spending cuts, more spending cuts than we have seen in a generation. Now they must say yes to common sense, fair increases in revenue, and choose good governance over political ideology. David Brooks, that conservative columnist I referred to, he said, the members of this movement talk blandly of defaults and are willing to stain their nation's honor, meaning that the country won't meet its obligations. We teach our children you have to meet your obligations. But this movement tells the country you don't have to meet your obligations. He goes on to say, if debt ceiling talks fail, independent voters will see that Democrats were willing to compromise, but Republicans were not. If responsible Republicans don't take control, independents will conclude that Republican fanaticism caused this default, and they will conclude that Republicans are not fit to govern. I would very rarely agree with Mr. Brooks, but I would agree that his observations in this case are absolutely right. This is about not only standing up for the nation's honor, it is about standing up for the nation's obligations. It is standing up to make sure that there is a fair and shared sacrifice, not those simply on the backs of middle-class working families in this country and those who have the least among us. That's the choice Republicans would have us make. It is a wrong choice for the nation. And I'm just hoping that we get to some sense of reality in this chamber that can help us move forward, have the nation be upheld in its obligations both at here and abroad, and not stop a ripple effect that will cause an enormous consequence to this nation's economy. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.